Imagine being so poor that your children were about to be taken away because of a debt you couldn't pay. You have no money, no food, and only one small jar of oil left. Would you still believe God could perform a miracle? The sun had barely risen over the quiet village. Inside a small, humble house sat a grieving widow. Only days earlier, she had buried her husband. Now she was left alone to care for her 2 young sons. Her heart was heavy. Her future looked hopeless. Every knock on the door filled her with fear. The creditors had come again. She owed more money than she could ever repay. In those days, creditors could take children away as servants. With tears in her eyes, she ran to seek the prophet Elisha. The widow finally stood before the prophet Elisha, her eyes filled with tears and desperation. Elisha looked at her with compassion and asked,
"What do you have in your house?"
Ashamed, she quietly replied,
"Your servant has nothing except a small jar of olive oil."
To everyone else, it looked too small. But God often begins miracles with what seems insignificant. Instead of giving her money, instead of giving her food, Elisha gave her an unusual instruction.
"Go and borrow empty jars from all your neighbors. Don't ask for just a few."
Her 2 sons helped carry the empty jars back home. When they arrived home, they closed the door, just as Elisha had instructed. It didn't make sense. But faith doesn't always begin with understanding. Sometimes faith begins with obedience. The widow took the small jar of oil and began to pour. The first jar became completely full. She poured into another, and another. The oil never stopped flowing. Soon every borrowed jar was completely full. Inside that small house, God was performing a miracle. Finally, there were no more empty jars left. The oil stopped flowing. The widow hurried back to tell the prophet Elisha everything that had happened. Elisha smiled and said,
"Sell the oil, pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on what is left."
God didn't just rescue her from debt. He provided enough for her future. This miracle reminds us that God is never limited by what we have. Sometimes all God asks is that we trust Him with the little in our hands. One small jar became the beginning of a miracle. The size of your problem never limits the power of God. The same God who provided for the widow is still able to provide for you today.